Welcome to the OverAnalyzers. I'm Dan. He's Mike. Let's talk about Puzzle Storm.
So this is the latest obsession of mine, and I got you on board. And I think you're interested in it too.
Yeah.
I remember last week-ish, or maybe a week or two ago, I brought up how a long time ago we identified these different buckets of where to put your time. You can, if you're trying to improve at something, you can invest your time in the improve your mental model bucket, or you can invest it into the improve your fundamental skills. And then there's the waste time bucket, which is not a bucket you're supposed to use. And I really wanted to.
It's a really big bucket.
Yeah, it's a huge bucket, but we're trying not to use that one. And it felt like we have not really explored the improve your fundamental skills bucket. And so I've been looking for answers for that bucket. And the idea of Puzzle Storm was the most exciting thing that I've come across, in combination with some other things that I've been obsessed with, like some of the neuroscience stuff and the Andrew Huberman podcast, which I'm still listening to, and stuff like that. Okay, I found this article on Hacker News from this guy. Do you know his name? Do you have that in front of you? I feel like we should shout that out at least.
Go to the last page.
Nope. Okay, we'll put a link.
If I find it, I'll spit it.
Okay.
Out.
This guy made a blog post essentially about how he improved 600 points or 600 elo in chess on Elite Chess, I think, in 6 months. I think it was. So he went from 1100, 1100, something like that, to 16 or 17.
1200 to 1800.
Okay, 1200, 1800.
Yeah.
So for context, I think, I could be wrong, but I think 1800 is like 75% of the player base. Like you're better than 75% ish, something like that.
You know what you're at?
For elo in chess?
Yeah, I don't know anything about
No,
chess
I haven't played competitive chess in a long time.
Okay.
I was at 600 or 700 when I did, which is terrible. Anyway, this guy, he wrote this article about all these different things he had tried to improve at chess. And he had a bit of a similar story to me in Starcraft, although it's a little bit different, and we can get to that. But he was playing at around 1,000, 1,100. It sounds like he started at roughly 1,200 and didn't know how to get better. He played, did a bunch of stuff, wasn't working. And so he explored lots of different methods. He explored something called the woodpecker method, which is interesting. He explored playing a bunch of puzzles or memorizing games and lots of different methods. And he talks about each one of them and how some he thought were beneficial, some he thought were a waste of time. But he in particular pointed to one that he thought attributed most of his improvement to this method, which is Puzzle Storm. So Puzzle Storm is a little game mode thing on Elite Chess, and there's similar stuff on chess.com and some other chess sites. Basically, you play puzzles, and for anybody who doesn't know, a chess puzzle is essentially some position from a chess game. It could be a bit contrived. It could, often enough, it's from a real game, where you have one side of the board that you're going to move, and there's usually some interesting thing that you're trying to pick up on. There might be a fork that you have to look for. Some of the easier puzzles, the good move to make is fairly obvious. Other times it's not so obvious. You have to kind of force a few things to happen before the interesting move reveals itself. Sometimes there's a checkmate that you can see if you just do a few things. It's essentially some interesting situation in chess that you have to solve. You have to find the best move in that puzzle. One of the things that this guy, who I don't know his name, which is dumb, this guy who wrote this article points out is that he did a whole bunch of...
Marcus Buffett, I think.
Oh, okay, great.
Or at least that's a name on here. I don't know if it's his, but
God, hopefully it's right.
Anyway,
we'll put it in the show notes. We're so professional. So one of the things that maybe Mark talks about is that he did a bunch of puzzles. And this is actually what I did early on when I was getting more interested in chess, which is you play a bunch of puzzles. And he said that did not improve his chess game at all. And that is also what I found. You can get into puzzle mode on any of these.
Are you talking about like real puzzles or chess puzzles?
Chess puzzles.
Okay.
On chess.com, you can do puzzles where it shows you a chess puzzle and you have to solve it. So you sit there and you think about it and you try to find it, and eventually you find it, presumably, and then you go to the next one and you have some rating on how consistently you solve the puzzles. If you solve them consistently, your rating goes up and you start seeing harder and harder puzzles. That's puzzles. So in this article, he says that didn't help. And that is also what I found. But he said that Puzzle Storm is what helped. So Puzzle Storm is where you do puzzles for about 3 minutes. The actual time can vary based on how many right moves you make or wrong moves. But essentially, you're under time pressure and you have to do as many puzzles as you can within 3 minutes. They start off easier, and the more you get correct, they get harder. And if I can't remember the exact rules, but if you make a few correct moves in a row, then you get a little bit of a bonus, like an extra 10 seconds. If you miss one, you get a penalty and you lose a little bit of time. But essentially, you're doing puzzles. It's the same thing, but you're doing them as fast as you can in this very compressed amount of time.
Yeah, you're dropped right into the middle of a game. Well, I guess technically it's a puzzle, but it feels like you're dropped right into a game that's already been started, and you have to figure out what the best move is. I used to play chess with my friend pretty often, but I don't know any strategies. It's just been kind of for fun. Yeah. So this was interesting to go back and try.
When I was trying to convince you to try this, you sounded a little reluctant, but you said that it was interesting for you, right?
Yeah. And actually, first when you said, play Puzzle Storm, I really just thought it was like a puzzle game. I didn't know it was related to chess, which looking back, I should have figured that out. But so it opened up and it's just, I'm in the middle of a chess game and the timer's ticking and I'm like, what? Oh my God, what do I do? And then I moved some stuff and then it's like, wrong, you lose. And then my 3 minutes was out, and but it's really fun. So even if you don't play a lot of chess, it's a very simple, fun game to mess around with.
It's 3 minute sessions, so it's pretty easy to just pick it up and do it. So here's the questions for today, because we're not really even chess players or a podcast about chess. Why is it that this person, maybe Mark, identified this as the most important thing? What is it about Puzzle Storm in particular compared to all these other methods that he tried that works so well? And how would you apply that to something else? One of the things that I did this week and last week was try to think about what is the equivalent of Puzzle Storm for something like Starcraft 2. And I will tell you what I did and how that worked when we come to it. But to me, this was a big, it was a solid area to explore when it comes to that second bucket of how do you improve those deeper things, the pattern recognition, the speed, the awareness, the stuff that you're kind of relying on the non-conscious parts of your brain for.
Right. And I was also trying to think about how this could relate to music and to art. And but let's first talk about what we actually think is happening while playing Puzzle Storm.
Yeah.
And then, how does that thing apply to everything else? But what is that thing? What's happening when you play Puzzle Storm?
Okay. Well, it's interesting to think about how just playing puzzles, at least for this guy, and like I said, for me too, didn't seem to help so much. And I think the major difference is that when you play Puzzle Storm versus just playing a puzzle where you're sitting there and taking your time and looking at it, sitting there, taking your time, looking at it, trying to solve a puzzle is mostly an exercise in calculating. You're looking at all the pieces, you're trying to think through all the options. If you're really being deliberate, sometimes you're really thinking about it, and you might think you have the right move, but you're gonna sit there and just be extra sure because you're trying to get puzzles as correct as often as possible. When you're playing Puzzle Storm, you can't do that because you're under time pressure. So if you sat there for 3 minutes to sort out the first puzzle, your score is awful. You are forced to not sit there and calculate so much. You're trying to see the move as quickly as you can. So it is an exercise in pattern recognition, and it's trying to force you to rely on the more unconscious parts of your brain. You know, you can sit there, anybody could sit there and eventually find the fork that's on the board. For anybody who doesn't play chess, a fork is basically when you have a piece, like a knight, let's say, and you move it somewhere where it threatens two pieces at once. Pretty often it'll threaten the king, and it maybe threatens a rook. And so the opponent has to, well, if they're threatening the king, they have to move the king because that's the rules of chess. So they move their king, you take your knight and kill their rook. So it's a very powerful move. So anybody could find a fork if you sit there and think through all the possibilities, but that's not that important for chess, because what you need is to just see the pattern. So when you're playing Puzzle Storm, because you're under this time pressure, you're forcing yourself to just see those things instinctively. And it's almost like the calculations and the stuff that you're doing with your very thoughtful, conscious mind, you're under this pressure to kind of shove them down into the deeper parts of your brain where you just see it. And that's kind of the exercise there, where increasingly, as you do this, stuff becomes more instinctual, where you don't have to sit there and calculate your way to seeing the fork, you just see the fork. Or you start to see the weak pieces, or you recognize patterns of, oh, there's a back row checkmate or whatever it's called. You just need to make these moves. Like, you start to see that stuff right away. Does that line up with your thoughts on it?
So I was trying to apply this same way of thinking to doing a picture or something. And there's this weird thing that happens when, if you look at a picture of someone you know, and that picture is super blurry and they're super far away, you can still tell it's them.
Yeah.
There's a name for this, but I don't remember it. That the bigger truths of, like, the form of their face and their bone structure and everything are so much more important than any sort of surface detail. And beginner artists will focus right in on the details immediately. So if they're drawing a face, they'll draw every tiny little hair follicle or highlight and, like, everything, every strand of hair, everything. And then they'll back up and they'll look at the picture, and it doesn't look anything like the person, and they just have all these marks everywhere that don't mean anything because the details don't matter. And I think with Puzzle Storm, you're dropped right into this game, and you're forced to step back and see the bigger truths, the things that really, really matter. And I've witnessed this in myself every time I have, like, a really quick deadline or the end is near with my piece, and I have to wrap it up and I have to turn it in. And I can be like 40% done with the piece, and it's due, at the end of the day, and I've been working on it for the whole week. And it seems completely impossible to finish, but somehow some kind of magic happens where I'm able to finish it in this weird feeling that feels very similar to how I feel when I play Puzzle Storm. It's that you're constantly stepping back, looking at the bigger truths, judging the most important issues, because you don't have time to focus on little insignificant details that are so tempting at times. Like, I want to zoom in and work on the details of this, branch of a tree or whatever, but really that doesn't matter at all in the grand scheme of things. So when I'm under that time limit, I'm forced to step back in a way that I don't normally work at. So it's like I switch into this different gear towards the end, and for some reason that gear carries me all the way through to the end. And the cool thing about Puzzle Storm is that it drops you right into that gear, because you don't have time to think about anything else. You can't think in any other way if you want to make a move. So you begin practicing in that gear, which is actually the most powerful gear that you have. So it's really cool how that works. And I was trying to think of an equivalent, and I haven't totally come up with one, because it's not like, if you gave me an unfinished picture and 10 minutes to finish it, I don't know, like, maybe that could be beneficial. I'm still trying to come up with some way that it could apply to art, but it could apply to, singular concepts where I'm, quickly trying to find the overall look of something, or, whatever. It depends on the concept I'm working on. But I've experienced that feeling of like a different, I don't know, bigger truth, bigger picture sort of way of thinking that I think is what's happening in Puzzle Storm. And it's practicing the most important skill that you have, is seeing that bigger picture.
I really want you to follow through with that, and maybe in a couple weeks come back and say, all right, here's what I have come up with as the Puzzle Storm
it all
of
out.
art. Yeah, well,
Yeah,
because that, like I said, that's what I did for Starcraft, and I got some really exciting results with that. So I want to hear what that might look like for you in an art context.
well, I have a couple different thoughts about it. One is that, well, in the case of faces and everything, it's that bigger truth. Even if it's blurry and far away, you can still tell it's them. That actually applies to everything. And this is strange, but I think it could apply to you playing StarCraft and to anyone playing music and art and everything. When we look at a scene, we don't see it like a camera does, right? Like a camera looks at everything, records every single detail that's in front of it, regardless of the subject matter, or like it has zero feeling towards the scene. It just records exactly what's in front of you. But as humans, we do not see that way at all. Not even close. Like we process color differently than we process light and dark. Like we actually process light and dark first, and then we process color, which, fun fact, is why action movies, when there's a super actiony scene, they're always monotone, because you get a headache if you have to keep figuring out the color in such quick cuts like that. Yeah. So if you watch an action movie, those scenes are usually monotone for that reason. So earlier ones, they didn't figure that out. But
is a black and white movie more relaxing?
Probably.
I mean, this was a trend that we were talking about recently. I have my phone in black and white all the time now to make it less engaging to me. And it works.
Yeah.
I mean, it really makes a difference.
I mean, color is also very relaxing and very emotional. But what I'm getting at is that you process them differently and at different times. And those aren't the only two aspects that you process differently. The way you look at something, the subject matter actually has a lot to do with how you see it. Like your visual experience of that thing changes every time you look at it, and from person to person in a way, because of their association with that subject. So if I look at, if I look at a theme park, like I'll see things a little bit differently than you will, because I know different things have different importance to me than they do to you. And so you will focus on certain things that I wouldn't focus on, and vice versa. So your visual experience changes. It's very different from a camera, I guess is what I'm getting at.
One quick example. Tell me if this is what you're talking about. So you would think that you would recognize a person similar to how a camera does, right? You see all the details and go, okay, that's the face that I recognize.
Right.
I remember once walking around somewhere, and I saw someone that I thought was my wife, Sam, from way far away. I mean, this person in a crowd, I can't even see this person's face, but they just walk, and they're probably in my vision for half of a second or something. I'm like, oh, that's Sam over there. And then after a while, I get closer, and I realize that it's not Sam. It was her cousin. And I mean, obviously, once I got closer, I realized that. And they don't even look alike, but something in the movement that I saw for this tiny fraction of a second from super far away was enough to trigger that identity in my brain. And then it turns out that it wasn't a stranger and just a total random, misidentification. It actually was a family member who obviously shares some, genetic way of walking or something. So,
finish. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's it. It's just, to me, it was interesting that my brain was willing to identify, like, there's no way I could articulate that, of what it is about just the particular way this person took a step that identified or made my brain think that. But it was very interesting to me that just this tiny little thing could trigger that.
Right. Which a camera would have handled that very
Right.
differently.
Right.
And there's so many subconscious things going on here. But one of the main important factors, actually probably the most important thing, when you are trying to identify what an object is, you look at the silhouette without knowing it, without consciously knowing this. The first thing you typically look for is the silhouette of that object. And if the silhouette is obscured or weird and you can't see it, you won't be able to tell what it is unless you go to a couple other factors. But I wonder if her silhouette was similar to Sam's silhouette. And
Likely.
or I wonder if your brain like switched. I don't know. It knew like it was family and it just jumped to the Sam. I don't know.
But my point with that anecdote was just that there's clearly something that you could not write out and put on paper and teach to a machine that my brain is picking up on that I don't understand, but I imagine an artist is intending to look for those things. I mean, I've seen artists put, 5 lines on a piece of paper and you go, oh, that's, some famous person. Like they can get the whatever essence there is in just a handful of brush strokes.
Yeah. So, and I could geek out about all the different things that make this stuff up. But if you are playing a solo on guitar and you practice through it, typically when you practice, you look at your fingers and you focus on like these little things, right? How one finger hits this note or whatever. Even if you're playing a lot, you're very like zeroed in on these small fragments of vision, and you're mostly focused on these smaller things. When you're put on the spot to improvise a solo, right? Just spotlight on you, improvise a solo. You mentally like step back, you mentally zoom out, and you see the whole fretboard and all of your possibilities, right? And you not only mentally step back, you visually look at the whole thing. So the mental aspect and the visual aspect are very much together. You step back, you look at it, and then you think, like your brain sees all the patterns, all these very simplified patterns. You haven't broken them down yet. You kind of go into all these patterns, like I could play, A minor arpeggios all the way up and down or whatever. I could do this, I could do that. And then you quickly find and pick like a giant pattern. And then you kind of zero in on that and then you go for that or whatever. But that moment where you step back visually and mentally, that is something that you don't often get to practice. Like it only happens occasionally when you're put on the spot or I don't know, in other like little scenarios, but it's not something that you typically go out to practice. Oh, I want to practice stepping back and, totally clearing my mind and coming up with this huge thing. Like it's just not something that happens. And I think Puzzle Storm does that for chess. I think you could look for ways of finding like that exact headspace and working on it because it's extremely important and so powerful. That's the thing. Is like that total clarity of thought, having the 3-minute timer on Puzzle Storm kind of forces you to totally clear your mind and only focus on like all the possibilities. That's like that mode of thinking. That's what I want to pinpoint in all these different pursuits. Like, how do I practice that total clarity, big picture, overseeing mindset? Does that make sense?
Yes, actually, this is cool because we didn't talk about this until now. We'd said, hey, there's this interesting thing, read this article, go do this, and then let's do the podcast and talk about that. So independently, I have a very, very similar take on it. The way I've started to think about my attention and my focus is a bit like a flashlight. You know how some flashlights you can twist the end and the beam narrows into this very bright, intense point, or it kind of opens up and it's dimmer, but it's much broader, which I think is similar to what you're saying about being able to kind of see the entire fretboard at once versus focusing down into one tiny thing of how you play this particular scale or chord or something. So that's been a major takeaway, and I'll tell you why, or I'll tell you what I did. Okay. In trying to translate the idea of Puzzle Storm into StarCraft 2, I had to think about, okay, what actually is it that's important about Puzzle Storm? And like we said, one of the most major things is the pressure. The reason why I think Puzzle Storm is so effective, but just doing puzzles, I mean, some people might get benefit out of puzzles. I'm not saying that it's worthless, but the reason why that seems to train something very different is because of the variable of pressure, that you are struggling against some type of pressure, in this case, time. So just doing something at your leisure is unlikely to get you there. So that's one aspect, and that's similar to exercise, right? You know, the
Right.
if you're trying to get better at pull-ups, you can't just do 5 pull-ups every day forever. You're not gonna wake up one day and be able to do a ton of them. You're going to have to progress and put some kind of pressure that forces you to adapt. So like the pressure is, I think, obvious, and you need that. So here's how I translated it to StarCraft 2. I started out with this series of challenges from this guy called Printf, who's a very, very unique and very good player. He plays these super micro-intensive styles where you know, the game is really short, you only have a handful of units, and you try to control them just perfectly to beat your opponent. It's a pretty unique style of play. And so he built all these challenges. There's 40 of them, and he set them up to where they're very, very difficult, and you can open it up in this practice mode in StarCraft, and you can play through each one. And they're really hard. And so I thought, okay, this seems fairly similar. It's these short challenges. It's this, you know, pressured thing where you're trying to achieve something inside of this very contrived, controlled scenario. And so I spent days and days going through these and I would do short sessions, kind of similar to Puzzle Storm. And my objective was to focus on them very intently. Or let me back up. A couple other important parts of Puzzle Storm that I think are relevant. One is the focus aspect. Like you said, it's only 3 minutes. You can't, if you're going to do anything with it, you're under time pressure, so you can't get distracted. You have to be focused. So that to me is something that's really key. So I thought, okay, while I do this, I'm going to take these short periods of time and I'm going to focus very, very intently as I can. And I tried to notice if anything would break my focus. So just I work in front of a window and people will walk by sometimes, and sometimes that would kind of pull my attention away. So I'd close the blinds. I have a second monitor. I had to turn that off. I had to disable notifications, flip my phone over. You know, when you're really looking for it, you start to notice that, man, there's a lot of stuff that'll pull my attention away even for a brief moment. So I tried to really get the focus ironed out. So that was really key. But I started working on these things, and the way I found to be really effective was to focus as intently as I could on the task. So in that sense, it's kind of like narrowing a flashlight beam. And I do that for a few minutes, and then I would stop and back up and like widen the flashlight beam and try to see the big picture of, oh, I'm trying really, really hard to move this unit in this just particular perfect way, but really I ought to be moving 2 units down here and 1 unit up there. And I would kind of take a step back, try to see the big picture. I would go watch this guy do it because he has a demonstration of him doing it, and try to identify any differences from what I did. And so I kept switching between very intense focus and then broadening it and trying to see the big picture. And it's very revealing because these challenges are extremely difficult. Some of them took me probably over 1,000 attempts to get through. And, you know, YouTube is full of all these people saying this one's impossible, it can't be done. And I'm like, I did it. But so that was a major revelation, is this idea that there's this, you need a very intense focus and then also a bit of a broader focus, and almost like switching between really pushing at a fundamental skill and then switching back to analyzing the mental model a little bit. You know, like with the guitar fretboard, you know, you might be that moment of stepping back, you might realize, hey, actually it'd be really interesting if I played this scale or this chord or did this unique thing. And then as you grind down into it, you're more focused on executing that or maybe doing it really fast or something like that. So that was a major takeaway for me.
Yeah. And well, I wanted to see if you have noticed this, but I was just thinking like, well, how can this apply to StarCraft? without having talked to you about it.
Yeah.
And if you don't know what StarCraft is, picture chess, but instead of how many squares are on a chessboard?
64, I hope.
Okay.
I think.
Instead of 64 squares, there's like 500 squares. And instead of little pieces, one piece could be 300 monsters. And then there's also like architecture and alien planets and stuff like that. So it's kind of like chess, but with aliens and monsters and stuff like that. But yeah. Anyway, so you were talking about like beginning game, mid game, end game, whatever. Like you have these different categories of thinking. I also have this with art. There's a lot of different categories, but with StarCraft, I bet, and tell me if this is wrong or if you've ever paid attention to this, but I bet at the beginning and probably the mid game, there's fewer characters on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And you're also kind of going through a lot of the motions, and I don't know exactly what you're doing, but I bet that visually you're very zeroed in on things, right? And as the game progresses,
yes,
yeah, okay. So as the game progresses, more and more characters show up. I mean, you've gone from 5 drones to 500 army.
You start at 12 workers, and a long game you might wind up on 80 or 90 or something like that.
On how many? Sorry.
80 or 90, something like that.
Okay.
Army wise, you might have 100 to 120 different, or let's say 100 different army units.
So you go from 12 to 100 characters. And as that happens, you have to continually step back. Not just mentally, but visually. You can no longer focus on a single character here and there. You have to, like, your eyes flick around and you have to see the entire picture all at once, which is exactly what's happening in Puzzle Storm. And I'm wondering if you've ever paid close attention to your actual visual experience, because I think... You seem excited.
Sorry, I'm just getting excited. Go ahead, finish your thought.
Okay. I think that people write off vision so often as just like, they're watching a film, or they're this camera, but it's not like that at all. And your visual experience and visual systems are so closely tied into the way you think and analyze things. And you may be able to trigger, and I think this would work with a guitar or a piano or with art. Like, you always need to step back, or you constantly need to step back, not just to visually see it, but to mentally see the bigger picture for all of these different pursuits. But I lost my train of thought. Go ahead.
No, that's perfect. So I wasn't done with my StarCraft thing. You are so right. You are super spot on. It didn't work. I spent days and days grinding away at these little micro challenges, and I beat all of them at the highest possible difficulty. And it didn't work. I didn't get any better. I kept playing games and I still was the same. There was a couple scenarios where, certain little battles would happen and I would go, oh, hey, actually, I think I can handle this better than I have before. So there was a couple little things that did help, but by and large, it didn't help. I mean, other than those little specific scenarios. And I'm like, well, this sucks. I did all that work and I worked really hard and I really thought I had it. I had all, I was trying to sort it out. Didn't work. And so I kind of went back to basics and started thinking about, okay, why is it that Puzzle Storm is so valuable to chess? And I think the reason is kind of what you're saying, in that Puzzle Storm causes you to kind of have to dilate a little bit, in that you're seeing the board. You're not fixated on a single piece. You're not looking at the knight and thinking through every single possibility of the knight. You're just seeing it all. And you're trying to get your mind to adapt and recognize those bigger patterns that you see in the entire board. So I thought, okay, start again, back to StarCraft. What do I do? So I found this arcade map that somebody named Neoblade has made. It's ancient. It's 5 or 6 years old. And he calls it a macro trainer map. Basically what you do is you're not fighting with a handful of little units or anything. It's the entire map. You start out with your normal workers, but you scale up to the hundreds of units that you normally get. You get maxed out. And what it does is it measures a couple specific things. You have to play your normal game, but while you're doing that, it gives you this little unit that you have to control, and it's being chased by a enemy unit or something, and the unit can't fight back, so you have to move it between rocks and do a bunch of silly little things to keep it from dying, and if it dies a couple times, you lose. So while you're doing all this stuff, you're also constantly having to worry about this little thing in the corner you keep having to switch back to. And then if you fail to, I don't want to get too into the weeds of Starcraft, but there's a bunch of little actions you have to take, and a lot of times they don't affect the outcome of the game in a major way. It's more like just little efficiencies of, oh, you have to cast this spell at this exact time, and you have to take this action at this exact time. So this trainer map, it takes all of those things. It gives you a very tiny or short duration timer, and if you don't take that action within that 30 seconds or something, you just lose. The game's over, you lost, you have to start again. So it's absurdly difficult, way more difficult than a real game in that sense, at least, in that you have to micromanage 1,000 things. You have to be jumping across the map to move this little unit around. You have to constantly be casting a spell. If you're even a second late, you lose. And then the game just throws stuff at you. There's all these random attacks that just happen all over the place, and you're forced to deal with those while, if you fixate on that for even a second too long and you forget to cast this little spell, you lose. And it's brutally difficult.
Yeah, I love that because, well, the mind state you have to be in to handle all of that stuff. I mean, just this avalanche of problems that you have to solve. You kick into this gear that you simply cannot recreate on your own.
Yes.
You have to have that outside force. This is kind of what I was trying to talk about last week, but you have to have that outside environment or structure there to overcome. You can't recreate it on your own, which is why I think learning on the job is so incredibly important. Mm-hmm. Or if you want to learn how to do something, you have to throw yourself into the fire, or throw yourself into the water and figure out how to swim. I don't know. That's a bit of a tangent, but that it's like you can only learn that type of thing in the real situation, or I don't know.
But what it was for me, there were, okay, just for context, I'm a pretty good StarCraft player. I'm within the top 1 to 2% of the player base. So part of me was a little bit skeptical of this guy's take. Not that, I mean, we read this article, he analyzed the different things that helped, but part of what I was thinking was, yeah, a lot of stuff helps when you're kind of in the middle of the player base, but if you're really up at the upper end, sometimes things can be a little bit different. So I'm wondering, how much are those concepts of Puzzle Storm really going to help me if I'm trying to get into the very, very tiny fraction of the top players in this game?
Right.
But what I found was that creating this environment of pressure, and I mean brutal pressure, and I was playing this on a difficulty that the original creator didn't even intend. It's supposed to be you just play till you die, but I beat it because I was really...
Good job.
Yeah.
Good job.
I actually been trying to get in contact with the guy to see if he's willing to share
just
some
to
of the original
brag.
file. No, well, yeah, I mean, I would start with bragging, but then I wanted to see if he would give me the file so I could make some modifications and make it harder.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. I haven't found him yet, though. Anyway, what I noticed was that at first it just felt like kind of hitting a wall of that this might actually be impossible, or I just keep dying at the same point. But what it started to do, really, really fighting against that pressure and like I said, having to just see everything at once and never spend any length of time in any one thing, I started to notice that in my normal play, I have these little moments of fixation, is what I'm calling it, is fixation, where let's say I know I need to make a unit. So I'll go to the structure where I make the unit, and I don't have quite enough money. So I wait, I'll sit there and kind of spam the button for 3 seconds until the unit starts and go, cool, got that done. And then I go to the next thing. It's just 2 or 3 seconds. The outcome of a game never relies on that 2 or 3 seconds. But when you're playing this stupidly difficult throw a million things at you at one time mode, it does. Because that 2 or 3 seconds, I should have been casting a spell or moving the worker, and it dies, and then I lose. And so it forces me in this very uncomfortable kind of way to eliminate those things, to where if I have 2 to 3 seconds to wait, I don't wait. I go do something else and then have to jump back. And it almost caused this like restructuring of things in my mind where there's more of a buffer of I can't just do this one thing and look at it and then get done and then go to the next thing. I have to do this one thing and think I have 2 more actions to take here, and before I do them, I jump over here, start this unit, and then jump back, or I jump here and then do that and then go back. And it's like these things are starting to get juggled in my head, and creating that pressured environment forced that to happen. Here's what actually turned out though. I hit my all-time highest rating in StarCraft 2 by far. I went on after really grinding away at this, starting to play games, I went on a massive, massive win streak. And if I had done this just a month earlier, I would have easily made into Grandmaster. Grandmaster is really, really hard to get into right now because it's the very end of the season. But my score hit easily high enough to have made it in if I'd done this just a little while ago. So I hit the cusp, but regardless, my rating increased by 200 points within days. And it felt like almost like a superpower, like switching back from this really grindy, intense drilling mode to playing a game. It's like time slowed down in the sense that just I'm able to do more in the same amount of time. I'm able to see more at once. I mean, it was like a tangible effect of doing this thing. It was really kind of insane.
Okay, so those small decisions that you make, or you're fixating on things.
Yeah.
For the last year or two, I've noticed this, and I'm calling them micro decisions, because I mean, I'll have like a building, and I'm like, should I put it right here or 1 inch to the left? And maybe I fixate on that for 2 seconds. Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. But then I go to the next thing and I fixate on that for 2 seconds and whatever, which all in all, it's not that big of a deal. Like, even if I'm super focused and I'm, totally in it, maybe that's a decision that would have normally taken 5 minutes, but I made it in 2 seconds. But when you are in an extremely high pressure situation, those micro decisions really add up. I mean, 2 seconds, right. Another 2 seconds, another 2 seconds. In intense pressure, you have to shorten those to not 2 seconds, but maybe half a second, all of them. And if you're making thousands of these micro decisions, compressing all of them down considerably, all of a sudden your time expands. And it's this phenomenal thing that I've witnessed happen with me. Like, they'll give me a task and say, this has to be done by the end of the day. And I'm like, this would normally take me a week. So yeah. You're kidding me, right? But then somehow I do it, and it's better than what I've done in a week. It's just, it's like a superpower, and I've been so fascinated by that. And it's like, why can't I do that on my own? And I think it comes down to compressing all of these tiny little decisions, these micro decisions, and it only happens under that extreme pressure. And they are not identifiable just by stepping back and looking at it. Like, right. I should have made this big decision differently. It wasn't the big decisions. It's all of these thousands of micro decisions.
Well, okay. So I will say this. I do think that there is definitely a place for those moments of where you do step back and look at the big decisions and whatnot, the analysis. But this guy that we may or may not know the name of, one of the things he pointed out in his observations about what worked was that he can play a game, then he can go back and analyze it. And this is the go-to piece of advice that anyone in the StarCraft community gives anyone looking to improve is watch your replays, go back in your game, look, see what you did wrong. And there is a benefit to that. And I'm not saying there isn't, but this guy, Mark, hopefully, was saying that if he analyzes a chess game, he can go back and go, oh, I missed a fork. But that doesn't necessarily do any good, because knowing that you missed a fork doesn't necessarily help you see it next time. You know that you need to find forks. That's a major tactic that you're looking for in chess. So nobody is thinking that, oh my God, I should look for this really valuable move. Same with playing StarCraft. Of course, you're trying to look for opportunities and take them. The problem is that your brain is not processing it in the moment. It's not fast enough. You aren't seeing the big picture. You're fixated on things, or you just aren't recognizing the patterns in the same way. So you're trying to train this thing, not necessarily, at least for this case, you're trying to train something specific, not sit there and be analytical and sit back and relax. That's, again, there's a place for that, and there are things that you can find that way, but creating an environment of pressure where you are forcing your mind to have to adapt and, like we said, start to dilate and not fixate on small moments and compress the time together, that's something that you are trying to just train. And I think that was such a major piece of the puzzle that was just kind of missing for me, of that's something you have to do. Like with StarCraft, watching the replays, that's good. But in a weird sense, it can almost be detrimental, because if you you play a game and then you go back and you sit there and you think and you analyze, you're pretty far away from that mode of really putting pressure to the point where it almost forces you to filter down into those really critical micro decisions that you have to make really, really fast.
So I've been kind of going back and listening to some of my old music that I wrote, 10 years ago, and I have hundreds of songs. And I was, trying to get back into the headspace that I was in back then. And I'm looking at my music, and I have like 20 versions or more of one song. And I look at the differences between them all, and it's like a single note change.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking that note was going to change the world, every single time. And what happened was I would rewrite and like just fixate on these tiny little details. And this is like different than perfectionism. It was a failure to step back and see the big picture. Maybe it's not different than perfectionism, but I was just fixating on these tiny little things, and I never had a pressure to force me to jump into that other state of mind that you need to be in order to wrap it up. I could never jump out of those micro decisions or those smaller fixations. I really needed that outside pressure or deadline or something to get me to finally step back and wrap it up, and see that those small decisions were not near as important as that overall song,
Okay, one more observation about this, and then maybe we can save the rest for a future episode, because I feel like we could get into all kinds of aspects of this. To me, this is one of those things that it's hard to explain. It's kind of intangible of, oh, you need to dilate your attention and filter down into what's important and not fixate. It's one of those, like, it's not catchy, and we're going to struggle to think of a title for this episode. Maybe we'll just call it Puzzle Storm, and nobody will know what we're talking about. But it feels really, really critical to me. And like I said, this week I'm on a bit of a high from getting such a positive result from even just some initial efforts pursuing this idea. One other thing that I think is relevant here with Puzzle Storm, let's say, you said you jump right in, and it gives you the most critical part of a chess game, hyper compressed to where you see this super critical part where you have to see the right move, and then as soon as you make the move, instantly you're on to the next one, and then there's this time pressure, and it's kind of forcing you to have to start to see these things. You could get that in a normal chess game, right? You can play, I mean, chess is pretty much always timed, unless it's, well, even daily chess, you only have one day to think about it, but often enough you're playing with only a couple minutes on the clock, and so you're having to make decisions really quickly. But often enough, a lot of the moves you make are relatively straightforward. There's not this clever checkmate move just waiting there. So at best, maybe you get, out of the 10 minutes of a game, maybe you get one of those, or maybe two, who knows. But if you just think along a time scale, if you if you played a ton of chess, let's say you played for an hour and you played 15 games, maybe 15 times you get to see this interesting moment and you're under time pressure to try to see it. But you play something like Puzzle Storm, you play for an hour, you've seen it 1,000 times. You're, in a very straightforward sense, you're just getting way more of these moments of really trying to fixate your mind on something. But I think there's something that might be even more important, and it's that there was a study that I looked at this week. These researchers took a bunch of people, and they were like amateurs. They never played piano before, and they had them try to learn some piece on the piano. And they had 3 different groups, where one group just tried to learn how to play this thing, and they're just playing on a normal piano or on a keyboard. And they had another group where they played on a keyboard, but every time they pressed a note, it would play a random tone. Like it would just be a random note. So it's, the keyboard's hooked into a laptop and it's like generating a random sound. So there's the normal group, there's the every time you press a key it plays a random sound, and then they had a group, actually no, there was 4 groups, sorry. There's the play normal group, press a key, makes a random tone. There's the silent group where they press a key and just no sound comes out. And then there was the single tone group where every time you press a key, it just plays an A or something. And just doesn't matter which key you press, an A comes out. Sorry that my explanation was a little clumsy.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah. What they found, and this is not surprising to me at all because I actually did this when I was teaching a lot, was that the groups who played where each key played a random note, they didn't do so well. They learned very poorly. The group who just played on a normal piano where it played the correct pitch for each note, they did significantly better than the random tone group. You would expect that. It's pretty disorienting to have a piano make a random sound every time you press a key. But the other 2 groups, the group who only played a single pitch every time they pressed a key, and the group that was silent, they did better than the group that was getting the normal piano sounds. And the reason that they said was that you are more focused on just the mechanical action of pressing your finger on each key if you're in one of these later groups, because you're not hearing pitches. You're just hearing a single one or you're hearing nothing at all. And so in a sense, you're just more focused on the actual critical part, which is seeing the keys and getting your fingers in the right place. And you would think, music is about hearing and associating. And yeah, it is. But at the start, when you're just trying to learn how to play a song, it's really about getting your fingers in the right place and pressing the right keys. I used to do this all the time when I was teaching. If I was on a keyboard, I would turn the sound off and have students play without any sound, especially for younger kids, but I think it's valuable for adults too, because it's just less to pay attention to. It kind of gets you to focus more on the actual important part of the action, which is getting your fingers in the right place and playing the right keys. So all that to say this, part of, I think, what you're doing when you're drilling and trying to isolate these skills and really push yourself is to try and strip away all the other stuff to where you aren't being distracted by the pitches and everything else, and you're really trying to isolate this thing that you're trying to improve. And that's something that I found with practicing Starcraft, was that if I'm playing a real game, I'm thinking about my opponent and the chaos of the game and what they're going to do, and oh my god, I'm winning and this guy's way better than me and this is really exciting. There's all this other stuff that's happening that even if I am hitting these moments of intensity and time pressure, and it's the ideal situation and trying to get me to eliminate those moments of fixation and whatnot, there's still a lot of other stuff happening. But if you can create a situation where that stuff isn't there and you can really just focus on the very important thing, I think that's really valuable. And there is some science that, more or less backs up that idea. Right. You can grab any random study and make it fit your point. So I acknowledge that, but I still think it's there. I think there's something there for sure.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts from you?
No, this was like one topic of like 5 that we wanted to talk about. So I which is great. I'm excited about the rest of them and this one. But no, I don't think I have any.
There's a lot that I want to talk about from bucket number 2. I think we need to explore that more thoroughly. I really want you to come back with here's what I figured out for art. Maybe you're setting a timer and speed drawing some particular thing or whatever, but I really want to hear what that would be like for you. How do you drill and do Puzzle Storm for art?
How do you puzzle storm art? Okay.
Yeah.
And from the audience, how does Puzzle Storm relate to what you do?
Yes. How do you puzzle
Figure it
storm
out.
music? How do you puzzle storm tennis? How do you puzzle storm anything?
And then let us know, because there's a lot of times that people will say something and it connects something for me.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
All right. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you next week. And sooner or later, we're going to get more into this idea of bucket number 2 and driving the fundamental skills. So let us know how this works for you. You can let us know here on YouTube. You can send us an email at the OverAnalyzers podcast at gmail.com. And as a side note, we love some positive, well, any reviews, take negative ones too, on podcast platforms. We'd love to get a little bit more exposure there. So thanks. See you next week.